journalist for Télérama. For those who are not French, it's a weekly cultural guide and a partner of this festival. We're going to have a chat with Roberto Toni, who is that guy. Hello, Roberto. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Oh, yes, I'm that guy.
Yeah, I'm here. It's a weird thing, but the most important thing is you see me and I see you, and yeah, everybody can see you. Thanks for being here with us tonight. We're going to have a chat about I May Destroy You. You were an executive producer for the show, created by Michaela Coel, who was on, the show was on HBO in the USA, BBC in England, and OCS in France, just to say those three countries. So I wanted to jump straight into the story of how the show was made, I mean, at least from your point of view. So for those who don't know the show, I was about to say what it's about, but maybe you're a better person than me to just introduce the show and say, you know, so it was obviously created by Michaela Coel, with Michaela Coel. She wrote it, directed it. Could you summarize the show for those in the room who might not have seen it?
How would I summarize the show? The show is about a young woman called Arabella, who is a writer. She writes. She's written one book, and she's trying to write a second book. And she goes on a night out with some friends, and someone spikes her drink, and she is sexually assaulted. And the show is about her dealing with that experience. And it's about how she, emotionally deals with something so major happening to her, and how it kind of affects her emotionally, affects her sense of the world and her life and her career. And herself as a black woman, and also the way it impacts on her social circle, her circle of friends.
So before you tell us about how you came to work with Michaela Coel, maybe there's a detail that is important to say, is that it's based on her own experience. So it's not a pure autobiographical story, but it is based on our own experience. So that's a detail that I think is important when you approach the story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not revealing anything here that Michaela hasn't said herself and been very public about. You know, I'd obviously hate to do that. But yes, when she was working on the second series of Chewing Gum, that experience happened to her. And I think she obviously, you know, it's a terrible, profound experience. And how one deals with that is not entirely straightforward. And she decided, when she was thinking about either doing something else or indeed thinking about that experience, that, you know, as a writer, the best way to deal with that is to explore it through fiction, or explore it through her natural, what she does, which is to tell stories. So, yes.
So the show aired a year ago, exactly.
Yeah.
Early June 2020, I think, right?
I think that's about right. I must confess, I'm a bit.
It was in the process of being
on
air a year ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can we start from the beginning, and can you tell us when you first heard about the project? Who came to you? How you got to start working on it?
Well, I think that all in all, it probably took somewhere between 2 years or 18 months before it was transmitted. My business partner in the company is a man called Phil Clark, who is the other executive producer with me and Michaela. And he knew Michaela very well, because in a previous life, he was the head of comedy at Channel 4 and had commissioned Chewing Gum, which was the show that Michaela had made. So he'd been across those two series, and they had a very good relationship and had talked about working together. And I knew her very vaguely, because when I, in a previous life, was at Channel 4, she was in this show that I commissioned. she had a starring role. She didn't write that. So I think she had spoken to Phil when we set up this company about possibly working together. And of course, he was, knows her and great fan and said, yeah, that'd be terrific. I think separately, she was having conversations with the BBC about this show and these ideas that she had for a show. And they obviously were very keen to work with her and said, look, it sounds like a brilliant idea, but maybe you should work with someone that you know and you trust and you think would do a good job. And so it sort of came together. I think she sort of said, well, look, I'd be up for the BBC are interested in me doing this show. Would you want to work on it? We all met, we talked about it. It sounded amazing. And so that it happened all quite quickly from that point on.
How was your first meeting? How far was she advanced in a reflection about what the story was to be? I happen to have worked, journalistically speaking, with Michaela while she was in the process of writing the show, and I know that it took her some time to figure out the story she wanted to tell, that she started from her own story and then worked on finding out a more universal way to tell the story. How advanced was she when you met her, and what was your first input, your first reflection in, okay, here is maybe how we can help move this thing move on?
Well, when we talked about it, it wasn't explained perhaps, as the show currently is, but she talked about her experiences and some of the ideas around that particular character and how she deals with it. But she also talked about, fundamentally the idea of consent and wanted to use that as a jumping off point to kind of talk more generally about consent and modern sexual manners and, I suppose people that she knew, her friends, her generation and their experiences and various ideas and stories that could kind of naturally grow from that. And there were some ideas that she talked about that didn't appear in the show, but there were some that did. And that was the original point. And, we talked kind of generally, but I do remember at the time she was filming a show. So she kind of went away to finish filming a show, which was called Black Earth Rising. Right. Yeah. And she was sort of writing. And then there was a point at which, it was clear she was writing scripts. And they just started to arrive. They, I think, in fact, I kind of saw like 6 scripts in one go, like literally, she does, I'm sure she won't mind me saying this. She does, she obviously thinks about it a lot and then writes in a real fury, like writes very quickly. And so delivered 6 scripts, which, quite a lot of that was what you saw. But there was a lot, then we began the process of working with her.
It's interesting how you describe it. I think she told me she vomits her scripts, like there's something like from her guts that comes out. It's interesting because how do you welcome that as a producer, that kind of, because it means there's a lot of work afterward, right? Does she give to you this, sorry for the image, this vomit of hers, and then you work on it? Together?
Yes, yeah. But to be honest, I don't mind that at all. I think, in fact, I think when we were working with Michaela, the idea of writers who are either planners or vomiters may have come up. I think Michaela does plan a fair amount, but then there's a point at which I think I'm sure a lot of people who work with writers and scripts realize that you can also plan too much. And you've got to allow some room for the magic, to find things. And sometimes you can't work out exactly how ideas are going to quite work. But instead of overthinking it, just kind of get it out there and see. And then and that was part of the process, that there was quite a lot of scripts. And then we could sit down and talk about them and pull out the things that we thought were interesting, or did we understand this? What are you trying to do with this? How do you see that going? And there was a lot of stuff that, ended up getting thrown out, and when I say thrown out, I should stress that Michaela is the first person to kind of throw things away and just suddenly, you might talk about an episode and she'll kind of go away, and then the script that comes back could be completely different. And you're like, oh, I didn't realize this was going to be so different. But I think that's part of the process. I think it's about exploring ideas and her kind of understanding how what people understand of what she's doing.
As you said, it seems that when she came to you, she already had in mind that there was both a very personal story and also a societal subject, which is consent. What was your, I mean, as an executive producer, do you want to find the right balance? Do you want to work with her on that? Can you go as far? Can you influence her that much, saying that okay, this is going to be on a large broadcaster, so we need to remember that there is a subject, or is the story, the personal story, the most important thing, and you don't want to turn the show into some kind of lesson or just a pure societal reflection?
Well, it's difficult, of course. I mean, you're dealing with a very contentious, very important subject, and it's a very painful subject for a lot of people. So you don't want to do something that you think is irresponsible. But fortunately, Michaela is incredibly intelligent and sensitive, and I don't think we at any point thought that she would be doing something that was going to be insensitive. We thought, I think I'm speaking for myself and Phil and the other people who worked with Michaela, it just felt like, she's doing a very interesting, thoughtful look at this subject. And, one of the big things, that, she always seemed very kind of keen on is, of course, at the start of the story, the character, someone drugs her and assaults her. That's, we're not questioning if that's wrong or right. We know that's wrong. That's not for discussion. But there's also those elements of consent, which are about the unsaid, about grey areas, about confusions, about, and I'm not sure there's a kind of necessarily with some of that stuff a right or a wrong. It was just interesting to explore. And I thought, there's one episode in particular that I thought was really interesting about her friend Kwame, who has a hookup with a woman called Nullifer, and he doesn't tell her that he's gay. And then when she finds out he's gay, she's angry and upset with her. And it was interesting that even when we were working, there was a lot of discussion around like, well, is that wrong? Is that right? How right is she to be angry? But also, of course, interestingly, because this is Michaela, so it's very clever, subtle stuff. There's also the fact that the woman he's with is fetishizing him as a black man, which I thought was so fantastic. And I've never seen that on telly. It's one of my favorite moments when she says, I like guys with edge. I like black guys. And that is, that is so loaded and interesting and complicated. And so, I just felt like she just had such brilliant ideas of how to explore these issues in a way that didn't feel, too kind of, kind of too preachy, but just really fascinating and interesting.
Of course, the key question, I guess you could almost I could just like drop my mic and you could talk about it for the next 30 minutes, is how do you find your spot as an executive producer when you work with such a strong voice as Michaela? Not only a strong voice about what she does, but the fact that she's creating, writing, directing, or at least sharing the direction, being the main character, plus it's based on her own story. It's so much her that you, as a viewer, you could imagine that she's done everything by herself, but it's a teamwork. So how do you find your spot so you can help her serve her voice, but still do your job?
I think It's a very good question, and I don't know entirely how to answer it, other than to say, fundamentally, it's Michaela's story, and sometimes when you work on certain shows, not a show like this, or, for example, say that you're working on a kind of cop show and it's a plot, it's got a certain thing it's got to do, and so, people pitch ideas, but I don't know. I think with Michaela, it just felt so authored, but there were things that she was exploring and you become the sounding board for that. And sometimes you do, all of us, it wasn't just me, there was Phil, there was a script editor called Natasha Phillips, and there was an associate producer called Tanya Qureshi. And we just talked a lot. And sometimes people talk about ideas on, oh, would that thing, something like this could happen. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, Michaela takes that away and makes it hers. And I think we felt very comfortable with that. But, it was interesting about, as the show developed, the end wasn't entirely clear. And there was questions, and I think Michaela had a lot of ideas about it, but wasn't sure where she wanted to land. And there was a lot of discussions. And I remember being in a discussion where even the idea of, maybe there isn't one answer. I remember being discussed. It was like, how do you end this story? And someone sort of saying, well, maybe there isn't one answer. And that was something that Michaela really latched onto and ran with and it created that, what I thought was a wonderful ending to a series.
So how do you make sure that you're not stepping on her inspiration? Does it mean that you have discussions and then it's like she goes away and you leave her alone because she needs to be in her bubble to create? And if she's like, I don't want to see you guys for 2 weeks, leave me alone, you give her that space. How do you make sure
Absolutely.
that her voice is never diminished?
Absolutely. It's that, I think, there is those relationships have to be built over time, and there has to be trust. And I think, like any writer, she has to feel that the people that she's talking to understand her voice, understand what she's trying to do, are there to kind of ask questions. And sometimes, I will be honest, sometimes I think you're even sometimes asking sometimes quite stupid, obvious questions, but it's a way of kind of helping the writer interrogate their own intentions. And is my intention working? Are the people who are reading it understanding what I'm trying to say? Am I getting myself across? But fundamentally, we don't sit with her when she writes it. She takes it away and she writes it. And often, that's the great thing about working with brilliant writers like Michaela. They'll come back, and you think you know what you talked about, and it will come back and it will be even more interesting and surprising. And she'll have come up with amazing ideas, and you'll just be like, wow, I thought I knew what we were talking about, but this is even more brilliant. And, when you're working with authors, very, singular writers like Michaela, it's about supporting that voice. It really is. It just works. Somehow, or it worked, I should say.
Maybe it's a naive question, but when you first met, did she had specific questions for you? What was her approach to your collaboration? Was she like, you seem to say that you were the first audience, so to speak. She was testing stuffs on you guys. Did she say like, okay, here is what I want to have, here's the help I want for you guys? Was that clear what she wanted to have coming back from you?
Yeah, I think she just wanted our opinion. I think, that you have to earn trust, but luckily, she had some of that already. And I think it probably helped that, we had a relationship with the BBC peers who had talked about commissioning it. And it's like, these people, will, they'll have the capacity to kind of understand what you're trying to do and be a useful sounding board. And it just, it just started with a series of discussions. These scripts came in, we read them, we talked about them, we had questions and thoughts and things we thought were brilliant and things we perhaps didn't quite understand, and just thoughts about how the story was being told across the series. And there were points, particularly say like in the middle, like there's an episode that's all set in the school, which is a rather lovely episode. I think it's episode 6. Yes, episode 6. But, when the first script of that came in, it was in a very different shape and it had a whole other thing in it. And it was only in talking about that and saying, look, do these two things work together? Are they working as a couple? Is it better to possibly separate those? And also where that came in the flow of the story, because I seem to remember there was a question about like whether or not that story worked if you hadn't yet met Theodora. So that, then became like, and we talked about, the order of certain things in the stories. So yeah, it was just a very open conversation. I don't remember her kind of saying, what I want to know from you is these things. It was just like, this is where I'm at. You as people who make programs and work on scripts, just tell me what you think. I want to hear what you think at this point. Because I think she's probably been living with it for quite a long time.
I'm sure it's complicated for you to tell me otherwise, but she always had the last word. Or are you
always?
Of course, or were you sometimes, when you have enough trust in people, you can accept. I mean, I'm not a writer, so I don't know. Maybe you could accept that your close collaborators could have a better idea than yours, and help you figure out that maybe you were wrong. Or was she always right at the end?
I'm not sure we ever argued or disagreed about anything. I know that sounds, I'm not being disingenuous there. I genuinely, I'm not sure it was ever a thing like there was a fundamental disagreement. Like, no, that's wrong. You can't do that. It was a kind of discussion, but at the end of the day, there's always, I think particularly because it's so authored, how she's going to do it, is important. I think that's probably true of any writer writing anything. I've been in situations where you're talking about something in a script and you're kind of going, well, I think what I'm saying might work better, but I'm very conscious that at the end of the day, the writer is the one who's got to write it. So it's better they write a good version of what they want to do than a bad version of what you think is right. But she just seemed so clear on it. And she was clear on, I remember we were talking about something in it one, and we were all very conscious that it wasn't quite working. And I think Michaela was conscious it wasn't working. And we were talking about like the way it, how it worked as a piece of plot. And I remember once sort of going, oh, well, if you want it to be quick, this could happen. And I just remember her very clearly saying, no, that can't happen. And I was like, oh, why? And she was like, oh, because this character would not do that. And that to me struck me as perfectly fine, that she was right. She knew those characters. And so even if it was an efficient solution, it wasn't true to her. And it was like, I've got to write this character how she would behave, not as helps, just makes the plot simpler. And so that's an example, it's she knows she knows these characters. She knows how they will respond. And actually, in some ways, that's what makes, it and those kind of pieces of work so interesting, that someone has such a kind of clear sense of those characters that it feels like they're just always being true to character. It's not like, oh, right, well, we've just got to shape this thing because that's the tidiest way of doing it. It's surprising, but they're true to the character.
Earlier today, in the same room, Ita O'Brien, the intimacy coordinator, was talking, and she worked on I May Destroy You.
Yes.
Did you have anything to do with that and with her work? And more generally, was there any discussion about, to go back what we talked about a few minutes ago, about how the show would depict all these very delicate matter of consent that the show is talking about? Anita O'Brien had a role to play, like on set for this.
Yes.
So were you together working with her?
No, I wasn't. I can tell you very clearly how that worked. That obviously we got those scripts, and even in those very first drafts, I can't even remember exactly if it was 6 or 8 eps, but they were clearly very explicit sex scenes. Both kind of consensual and non-consensual, and just maybe it's because the idea of a kind of an advisor, a special advisor to help you with that stuff had been talked about. I think there was quite a lot of discussions in the industry generally about it. But I think literally from one of our first meetings as a team, we were like, right, so we're going to have to get a kind of an intimacy advisor on this. This is incredibly sensitive stuff. It's got to be handled right. You can't just say, oh, right, well, the director and the actor will turn up on the day and do it. And so very quickly, I think from the point at which the director was on board, one of the big things was we're going to need to get, an advisor for this. And I know that either the producer or the director had found Ita. And at a certain point when they were doing rehearsals before production started, that they had a number of meetings with her, and the cast about how you do this, allowing the cast to talk about what they were comfortable with and weren't comfortable with. And that was something that we just entirely trusted them to do. And I remember talking to them after a couple of their sessions, and they were saying how amazing it was and how useful it was. And, explaining, and then, of course, that becomes part of a production meeting because, for example, one of the actresses involved wasn't comfortable. I know, I don't want to discuss who, but wasn't comfortable doing certain things. So a body double had to be got. So then that becomes part of a production discussion. But in terms of that work, I think we all felt that was quite intimate and they should be left to do that,
I have
just that very tight group.
Sorry, I have 2 last questions before we might have questions from the audience. The first one, you said that there was 6 or 8 episodes. I think remember talking with her. She insisted on having 12, which is a quite unusually long. Well, it's a mini series. It's a limited series, so it can work like this. But 12 episodes is quite a lot.
Yes.
How was the discussion about that? Do you remember? How you guys got to have the 12 episodes she asked for?
Do you know, it's a very good question because, as I say, at the start of it, it wasn't entirely clear exactly what the series was or quite how it would work. But from the very beginning, she kind of was like, I want to do 12 half hours. And I think part of that I sensed in the process was about the fact that she really wanted to kind of do something that kind of took place over a very long period of time and had the space to kind of do little diversions, like in episode 3, which is effectively all a kind of flashback, episode 6, which kind of is another kind of flashback further. And she was just very clear. And, I don't know, as I say, when the script started to arrive and we started to break down the stories a bit and talk about them and the shape of them, and that shape did appear. And there was just a point at which it just felt like that's completely natural. That feels like it doesn't feel like there was there was never a moment where we were like, oh, should this actually be 10 or should this be less? It just felt like it fitted. And also because I think the other reason it felt so natural was the fact that that journey that the character goes on isn't straightforward. There's a whole period where she appears like she's okay, but what becomes clear is that the trauma, even if externally she seems okay, she's internalized it and she's struggling to deal with it and she's dealing with it through other things. And so it just felt like that gave you the space to kind of take this person on this journey and also, not that it's this literal, but there was always this idea quite early on that, oh, this story takes place across a year and there's 12 months in a year. And it just seemed like a very natural shape to do it. But I think sometimes you sense that. You sense, this is enough space to tell this story and to do it justice.
One last thing, which is maybe more technical, well, maybe not, maybe it touches on the story. As I said, it's BBC and HBO. Does it mean anything that you have two channels from both sides of the ocean? How did that impact your work, if it did?
I have to say, that is always a big worry, because you simply think, well, what happens if the people who are paying you, that you do have to listen to, disagree? It never happened, not once. I mean, there's a lot about this show that is wonderful, including, I like to think that, the show itself and the experience of doing it, which was, incredible, and the response has been incredible, and it's been the whole thing's, for us felt like a blessing, and we're delighted. But that another thing was just how well everyone got on, But I think it helped that vision seems so clear that both the BBC and HBO, I think, just got it. They got what she was trying to do. They kind of understood how we were trying to support her in that. And I don't honestly remember, and I don't ever remember it being, it causing any friction. In fact, I remember it being very positive. I remember, in fact, the HBO, after the read-through, having a question about one episode and just like questioning one small bit of it, and then actually that episode changing quite a lot from the read-through. But actually, I think it turned into a better episode for it. And I don't think Michaela was doing that in any way under duress. I think she thought, oh, that's quite a good thought. And actually, as it happened, ended up using something that we'd been talking about in the past, but had never quite managed to make work. Which was, and that's episode 9, which I remember that very vividly. And so, no, it doesn't always work like that. And, and I'd hate to be in a situation where it wasn't working, because that would be a very difficult conversation. But honestly, people just, the broadcasters got it. They just, they trusted her. They trusted us. It was a great experience.
We have 5 more minutes for questions from the audience. If there are questions from the audience, I'd say a couple of them. So if anyone wants to ask anything, there's a mic available. No, maybe not.
To ask a question, if that's okay.
Sure. Please go ahead.
Sorry. I was wondering about the intimacy consultants. Is it a consultant?
Yeah, intimacy advisor.
Intimacy advisor, yeah. How recent has this job been? I mean, how long has it been around? Because I feel like it's very recent. I've only heard about them for like a year or two.
It's a very good question. I must be honest, I don't think I can give you a kind of definitive answer, but I have to say that when we started this, it was something I'd heard of. It may have been that some people I know had made a show and had talked about it, or I'd read about it. I think also, there'd been a lot of discussion about kind of practices in Hollywood and things like that. And so I think we just knew of it. I don't think I hadn't ever worked on anything that had employed one, but I knew that such a role existed. So it just seemed obvious from the start, we have to get one. We have to kind of ask someone to help us with this.
Of course, yeah. And how do you feel for the actors? How does you feel it changes their experience on the show? Do you feel like it makes them much more comfortable? Do you feel like the actors have been waiting for such a job to exist? Because I feel like it might be very uncomfortable having people who don't really know what they're doing.
I think they've really appreciated it. I think even, I'd love to think that anything that I've ever been involved with would never behave this badly. But you do hear stories about people, particularly, I believe there was a whole thing with, she called Emilia Clarke on Game of Thrones, talking about, being still a relatively young actress and, you're part of a big thing and then you turn up and, you're not kind of like, there's not a lot of preparation. It's all rather insensitively done, So I think for the actors, it was absolutely important, and they got to kind of sit down and spend time and really talk about what the scene needed, but how that could be done in a way that they felt comfortable with. And everyone feels differently, so things were done differently for different actors.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Roberto. We might have time for one last short question if there's anyone else in the room, but if not, we'll watch a couple of episodes. And I'll start with...
Okay.
Yes, we're going to watch some episodes on the big screen behind me.
Good.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And,
not at all. Thank you for asking me. I hope that was helpful or interesting.
It was very interesting. And have a nice evening, and good luck with your next project.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Thank
so
you.
All right.
Thank you.
See you. Take care.
And so I think there are 2 episodes coming, so I'll let you with that. Thank you very much.